Priscilla, welcome to the Power Within You podcast. It's really lovely to have you here today. I was saying, like, before we recorded, I could talk to you for hours. I just realised that, so we had to interrupt our conversation to do this episode. But I'm really glad that you've come on and been part of season 2. How are you today?
I'm not keeping too badly, actually. Just enjoyed the bank holiday weekend, which was nice.
Yeah, it's so
Um,
nice. It goes so quickly, though, doesn't it?
it
Really?
went super quickly, but I always feel grateful for that. When you think it's a
Yes.
Monday and you realise it's a Tuesday. Always a
Yeah.
blessing.
And then you're either excited about the Friday's approaching, or you're like, oh my God, I have so much work to do and prep for. I need to get this done.
It's a hybrid of both for me. It's usually like, great, oh, I've got a lot to do, and then I have to settle into it.
Yeah, exactly. But it's really, really wonderful to have you on here. I'd love for the listeners to know more about you and what you do currently as a profession.
Sure. So I'm a psychologist, both research and practice. So from a practitioner perspective, I see sort of clients through organisations or sort of through my own client base, etc. I'm also taking part in academic research. So there's a couple of pieces of academic research that I'm working in, but also working with organisations and sort of facilitation, training, specifically kind of culture change and diversity and inclusion. That hasn't always been my way of working. So I've in probably around 2018, I sort of started making a bit of a transition.
Mm.
But prior to that, I was in banking. I was a management consultant in banking for about sort of 12 or 13 years. So I worked with a number of top tier banks and financial regulators, etc. But my interest really grew into the area of sort of coaching, specifically coaching
Mm.
psychology and other aligned disciplines. So thinking about things like clinical psychology and how they all came together. Um, and that led on to a social enterprise, which myself and my partner we created, which was looking at psychological interventions and broader interventions for survivors of domestic abuse. So it's a
Wow.
range of different things, which kind of caters to a range of my interests.
Absolutely. I love that you did a 180 in your career as well. Like it happens, no? Like sometimes you do a degree, you kind of just fall into it, like you just sort of get into the corporate world. And then I guess your priorities are like, to be able to, buy a house and pay for your mortgage and like have a good life and go on holidays and that sort of stuff. And then suddenly sort of with me, I've sort of left feeling a bit empty about like, is this it?
Yeah.
This is what, and although I enjoyed what I did, I think the switch for me was being coached myself and
Yes.
understanding that I have potential. I don't just have to be in delivery or a project manager for the rest of my life. I can do more. But it was based on my parents and dad being in banking for like 50 years, as well. So a long time to be in banking.
50 years, really?
Yeah, he only retired at 79, actually. Yeah. So it was a long time. What was that switch for you though? Like, because it's from banking to what you're doing now is quite a significant shift. What was that? What triggered that 180?
It was exactly, it's funny, you've just said you coaching yourself, and I was like, yeah, that was it. I got to this point, and I think I was around sort of 35 at the time, and they
Mm,
talk about neurologically, there's that sort of shift developmentally that happens in our brains around that time. And similar to you, had a bit of a, could I do something? Where do my interests lie? It's when you start
mm,
asking what do I enjoy?
mm,
What kind of things interest me? And it wasn't that what I was doing didn't interest me, it's just that I knew that there was room for a bit more. So
mm,
I decided to sign up with a coach as well and work with, and it was fantastic. It was eye opening. It made me introspect and ask the questions that I don't think I'd have taken the time out to ask the questions myself.
yeah.
And really, that sort of went on for about 9 months of sort of
Mm.
picking up sessions and having different blocks of sessions and being really goal focused. And that's when it really started to change. I started to ask myself some of those deeper questions, and
Yeah.
opportunities started to show up in my life, and I really started to say yes to a few more things that interested me. So
It takes courage though, I think, like to be able to do that is it's a risk, isn't it, when you're around that age to kind of like change your life up, completely. I like that you said goal focus because I never worked in goals. I was like, what goals? Like I guess in the corporate world you had objectives and you did yearly appraisals, but I never really applied personal goals to myself. I don't think. I just kind of let life happen to me.
yeah,
And then before you know it, you end up being 40 years old going, what am I doing? But then I got really goal focused and I went a bit nuts in it. I did the whole book of 100 goals. I put pictures and that sort of stuff as well. So I could really understand what they were. So I went overboard perhaps on my goals. Some of them are still relevant for sure. But I realized I kind of like was reaching them quite naturally when I was able to understand what they were. if that makes
Yes.
sense.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
completely
definitely.
understand that. That really resonates.
How did you know? What were your goals back then at 35? Like, what is it that you wanted to achieve?
To be more. It sounds
Mm,
really kind of to do more, to find out at the time in the very early stages. It's very simple questions like, what do I enjoy,
mm,
or what would I? I think there was one of the questions which was around what would I do if money were no object, and then
mm,
that's when it starts. You start to asking those. There's of course the practical questions because there's life to live and there's bills to pay, but then you
mm,
start to bring fun and excitement and interest. It's an underrated word, interest. That real things that really pique my interest. I want to read more. So those were the goals. They were really quite high level at the start, very high level, very kind of broad to
mm,
allow me to start exploring some of those things. So sometimes it was talks, sometimes it was networking, sometimes it was podcasts to just see what twigged and where my interests lay. And it really started to, I'd studied neuroscience and psychology at university, and it really went
mm.
back to psychology, went back
Yes,
to some of those principles.
yes.
Um, I'm relatively numerate and quite enjoy that kind of scientific, logically ordered brain. So going back to some of those papers was where my interest started until I was able to start shaping and seeing what that could look like, what that bigger picture could look like.
I love that. I'm not very numerate, so I think I need your help when I do my dissertation, please. I've been terrible like my studies. I actually got very scared by doing an MSc, like I just because it's so intense as well, isn't it, as well? But I love how you explored your values and your beliefs and what you wanted. And often when I start a coaching program, we always start with values because I always say to everyone, what are your values? They're like, don't really know, to be fair. And then, it's amazing how people, probably 95% of the room don't know their values or their
Yes,
core beliefs.
yes,
And it's just important starting with that, isn't it? Because then it just takes you on a journey, I think, as well.
it does. It really, really
Yeah.
does. I agree.
So your interest in psychology then, like when you did your degree, it led you on to kind of establishing social enterprise called Encouraging Her. Is that correct?
That's
The
right.
amazing. And that's been and so tell me more about why your focus was specifically in what you're doing now.
So, encouraging her, we're working with, at the time, female survivors of domestic abuse.
Mhm,
And the why was it's a social cause. So, I'm not a survivor myself, but I do
mhm,
know a good number. And I think if we all look at our own social circles, social circles, let's say,
mm.
we all know some, a few, we will all know. And it's just an area of interest that just really got me and it really resonated with me. And when I sort of started to dig and say, well, why is it that I'm interested? It's um, there's a really deep level of empathy that I have for people in
Mm,
situations where their power is taken away. That's
mm,
ultimately what it boiled down to. Um, and had conversations with people in the past who said, "Well, if you're not a survivor, then why?" And that's the why.
mm,
It's that deep empathic feeling of somebody being in a position where they are powerless, they don't feel powerful, they don't
mm,
feel their worth. It's the resonation with that as a core. So we went on then to design a number of services that would look, some of them psychological interventions that would look to support survivors. Um, and
mm,
what we looked at is looking at survivors. First of all, we sort of started off working with female, encouraging her working with females. But more recently, and it's a well known fact that domestic abuse also affects men, people from LGBTQ relationships, a range of different people. So it's a really common issue, even though it's gendered. It's a common issue
mm.
across different societies, different communities, and in a sense affects us all.
It really does. And I don't think there's a massive stigma attached to it as well. We don't really speak about it and discuss it. And we're not really aware of what's going on behind closed doors for other people as well. Like, why do you think there is, you know, such a stigma around it? Like, what are people afraid of their partners? Are they afraid of society? What is it that kind of like drives that stigma, do you think, still?
I think if I was to sum it up in one word, it'd be judgment. So there
Mm,
is the when you then have to, judgment is one word, and the others is the assumptions of others. So one
sure.
is then the admission of in a lot of cases, people don't realize they are in situations which are abusive. The realization
Mm,
isn't necessarily there. And I think there's been lots, certainly done within the UK, to raise the visibility of what domestic abuse is. We have a new act, and there's a new sort of common definition, but people on a sort of a day-to-day basis don't necessarily recognize what the signs are. But then when there is a recognition of what those signs are, then follow the fear of judgment, the shame, the guilt, because there are lots of assumptions around how, or certainly the type of individuals who end up in abusive relationships. People make assumptions of people who would end up in that type of relationship. And that fear of judgment becomes so deeply entrenched that people often don't talk to anybody. They don't speak to people. They don't go out and look and see what services are out there because of the sheer stigma and shame.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting coming from an Indian background and the way that, the culture is constructed at times, right? Is that the man is, the more dominant one and the one that makes the decisions and that sort of stuff as well. And I've just seen it, like women are so passive as well in sort of heterosexual relationships. Women can be so passive in those relationships where it's kind of like, it's not even, it's kind of like not expected, but almost it's all right. It's normal if they're getting shouted at or abused, or like it feels really, and that still happens,
Yes.
and I wonder whether there needs to be a cultural shift or cultural education like that for women, that they don't have to be in that,
Yes. Yeah.
as well, because I feel like there's so much of it.
Yeah. You're right. The prevalence is quite substantial. And we're talking about heterosexual relationships, but also we talk about some of
Yes.
the heteronormative elements, and that's occurring in same-sex relationships as well. We're talking about that power play, those dynamics. But if we're talking about education, I absolutely think an education is needed and is required, but for both sides, for perpetrators or
Correct.
survivors.
Correct.
Perpetrators needing to understand how their behaviours impact others, and
Yeah,
to understand
absolutely.
themselves. To I mean, this is quite reductive, but the whole idea of being able to self-regulate, the whole idea of being able to understand perspective from a perpetrator's perspective, but from a survivor's perspective, understanding what good looks like, understanding self-value and self-worth, and what to expect and what not to accept. It's like a two-pronged attack to that sort of educational program.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very true, isn't it? And I mean, being in that kind of environment. Did you start encouraging her before COVID then, before the
We
pandemic?
did, yeah,
Was
which
that
was
we did?
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because in the news, there was so much, there's a lot about domestic abuse, I think, that came up because people couldn't escape their partners and stuff as well. Did you experience that as well, of seeing a rise in, yeah.
Yes, quite significantly. And interestingly, what we'd done is we'd started with a pilot program. And part of that pilot program, what we did was we pivoted and we held it online. But it was interesting looking at the news reports and the need that was coming through at the time. You did have people who were in situations where they were locked down with their survivors. And as a result, then they couldn't contact families and friends, couldn't leave the house as much as they usually would, and were instantly thrown into these new patterns of living, as we all were, but which obviously led to increased heightened risk. So calls to the National Domestic Abuse Hotline increased, and to all of the national charities. And one of the other things that was noted as well, and this is sort of much broader in terms of services, the severity of cases had increased. So there was a severity of increase, not just numbers of occurrences. It is a crime that's traditionally underreported. So it's difficult to tell whether it was the number of reports that, lockdown exacerbated reports. But in order to be able to have a look behind that data, it was, were more people encouraged to report because they had more opportunity, or were we looking at, it's all really, really very complicated. But either way, really, domestic abuse rose to the published consciousness over that.
Yeah, absolutely. It really did. And I just felt, gosh, the sort of, what you could feel, the grief, and, just being able to, it was just horrible what people were going through. And I just felt awful. And you can imagine how people living that situation are feeling. And it was just, yeah, I'm so glad that we came out of lockdown and people were able to go back out and get the help that they needed. Because that in itself, just being locked down, obviously caused a lot of issues in terms of mental illness, mental health. But so there's domestic abuse, so there's physical abuse that is quite easy, is probably easier to recognize and think about what that means. And there's also emotional abuse as well. So the physical might not exist, but the emotional does. How can someone recognize the signs of emotional abuse? Because I think it's quite difficult sometimes, though, that if you've got a particular dynamic, like what occurs in that sort of situation?
Well, domestic abuse, when we're talking, yes, you're quite right, it's physical and we'll talk about emotional, but the Act in 2021 brought in a whole new realm of definition. So when we're talking about domestic abuse, yes, we're between intimate partners, but we could also be talking about in familial situations, from parent to child, from child to parent. We're talking about two people being intimately connected. So that could be partners, that could be familial or broader relationships. And yes, we could be talking about physical, we could be emotional, financial, coercive. So it really broadened and established that definition. And you're right, people who are in relationships where there is no physical violence, but there are other types of abuses, even clients who I speak to will say, well, I wasn't hit, or well, I didn't.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? It's all right then.
It's kind of,
it's very true.
But they say, my case isn't as bad as somebody else's because I wasn't physically touched. But in answer to your question, what to look for is, I think probably one of the key things, our emotions are such a key guiding factor in our lives and often ignored, is the conversations that are being had. How do they make you feel? And I'm not talking about things are unfair or you're feeling, moaned at, or I'm talking about, are they deeply calling into question who you are? Are they making you second guess yourself? Are they making you second guess your values, whether you were right or wrong? And are you spiraling into those thoughts? And I think being able to, it can be very subtle. And I know terms like gaslighting and things are out in the public consciousness. It's subtle, but the guiding factor, because it's so personal, the guiding factor is, how am I feeling emotionally? People are starting to question themselves in a way that they didn't before. If people are noticing in that relationship they feel far worse than they do before, or it's started to change or alter their sense of self, it's a relationship you need to just stop and question. How am I feeling in these discussions? How do I feel in these interactions? It's emotions tell us a lot.
I just love that you said that. I say this in lots of because it really upsets me that we're not taught to be in line with our emotions. Like, we're not taught at school, we're not taught anywhere, and unfortunately then the emotional culture continues with our parents, and cycle continues. We just don't talk about our emotions, and so we're second guessing our emotions always, aren't we? We're thinking, how do I actually feel? Do I feel a certain way? Is it valid as well? I think so much emotional education is needed to fix a lot of core issues, or to start fixing a lot of core issues, to really be self-aware about yourself and understand you as a human being, to know what's right and wrong, to know what you're feeling. And like you said, like if you're being gaslighted, or someone's, and especially if you've been in the dynamic for so long, like some people just don't even, they can't. But I like what you said about understand how you feel, and understand how, if you're feeling uneasy, and like, I don't know, are there techniques that people can use? Like, how do they become more aware of their emotions, do you think?
Certainly one of the things that I've worked with and I've used with clients is almost bringing mindfulness, bringing an element of mindfulness into practice. And when I'm talking about mindfulness, I'm talking about literally being still and understanding what you can feel in your heart. Or where you can feel a sensation in your body. Where do you usually feel frustration? And that's different places for different people. When you're having this interaction, how do I walk away feeling? How is it embodied within me? And also, what then happens to my thought processes about myself? What happens to my thought processes about life? And I think a lot of those things require people to just stop and just introspect. It can be for a really brief period of time. But because our lives are so busy, we very rarely have that chance to kind of stop and have that bit of ordered thought. But very similar to what you were saying about when you were changing career, you had to stop, focus, and set some goals. This is that very first point of stop. How am I feeling it? Where am I feeling? When I think of this, how am I feeling? How are my emotions responding? Can I feel this? And that can be done by most people. In most situations, you just need to.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I love that. I think that moment of reflection is so important, isn't it? And we don't do it. And also, we're scared to do it as well. We're scared to even deal with how we feel. So we busy ourselves to avoid any processing of emotions as well, don't we? And that comes out then in disease or stress or burnout. Are there any sort of common mental health issues that you see from survivors of domestic abuse? Like, what type of things do people go through?
Self-worth is often diminished. So
Mm.
when we're talking about that idea of sense of self, that that Rogerian sense of the whole person, there is a sense of self that's been damaged often, and just related back to a point that I made earlier around people making assumptions about survivors and where survivors exist. Often we're talking about people who are working in busy jobs, busy lives, managing teams, who, because
Mm.
they are then impacted by a level of self-worth, which may then impact their imposter syndrome, and impact
Right.
several other areas related to that, namely confidence, self-respect, view of self, all of those things. Because their self-concept is therefore impaired, that then
Mm.
what you find is that then is projected into other areas of life. So how they may show up as a parent, they may question how they show up as a parent, how
Mm.
they show up as a line manager or as a boss or as an employee, how they show up for their
Mm.
friends. So it's this one instance that has the impact that can ripple out into various different domains of life. And what may
Mm.
seem quite simple, like sense of self, has such an impact on that person's ability to be able to see themselves and rationalize that it really can have a wholesale impact on their lives more generally.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of words or imposter syndrome is quite common, isn't it? When you kind of see that. And I never actually related it to domestic abuse, to be fair, which I think is, thank you for highlighting that as well. Because there might be various reasons why people or women or anyone who is suffering from imposter syndrome suffer from it, because it's complex. It sounds complex as well, and to kind of overcome that as well. In terms of in your work and your interventions, could you give me a couple of examples of how you help people of domestic abuse? Like, what is it? What work do you do? Because I think it'd be great to kind of understand sort of any
Sure.
advice you can give, basically.
So we work with a series of interventions, psychological interventions. So there's a specific
Hmm.
program that we piloted back in 2020, and myself and a colleague of mine are producing a paper to count as sort of evidence-based behaviour
Amazing.
for a wider rollout. And in terms of it's a culmination of different tools from potentially applied neuroscience, tools from positive
Hmm.
psychology, looking at areas of coaching psychology into a combined intervention. So if I was to give you one example from the area of positive
Hmm.
psychology, character strengths, the understanding that
Hmm.
each of us has a unique set of, or everybody has a unique set of 24 character strengths, which are rearranged slightly differently for different individuals. Having an understanding of what your strengths are, and we're not just talking about sort of, this is evidence-based, strongly evidence-based information. If we understand who we are, and this is understanding who you are irrespective of the abuse that's occurred in your life, understanding who you are and understanding what you're good at. And certainly the premise of this intervention is, when you focus on what you're good at, naturally all of the other
Hmm.
things come up into line. So if somebody
Will
has a
come
strength
through.
in
Yeah.
creativity and they have that opportunity to use creativity in some way of their life because of their positively oriented thinking. This isn't discounting the negative that has happened, because we deal with that through separate practices, but somebody being able to recognize if they have an impaired self-esteem, what sense of self and self-esteem, what they are good at, what they do well, and apply and practice that more throughout the course of the program. That's one pillar of looking at perhaps trying to repair and restore and help people to understand they are still good at, they are good at. And there was a
Mm.
person prior to the abuse, and there is a person after the abuse, and how do those two different characters align? Those two different personas meet.
I think that's wonderful, isn't it? Like, recognizing your strengths is so important. It's really interesting you said that. I bought some cards the other day, um, at your best cards, I
Yes.
think they're called.
Yeah.
You get them out Amazon, and I used them for a workshop last week, actually. So I got everyone to like sift through the cards and think about their strengths and stuff and how they could take it forwards. I'm really glad that you said that, because it sounds like it's a really positive thing to do then for people, basically, right?
Incredibly, it's such a good exercise. And I think, and even more so if you struggle to see your strengths yourself.
Mm,
I think if you can't see the good in
it's
yourself,
true.
seeing something which is
Yeah.
relatively objective, that says to you, oh, these are the things, and if you resonate with that, I think they can be something quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, and it's that standard like interview question: what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses and stuff. And when we do that, it's quite high level, isn't it?
Yeah.
We just think about like the things that we might be good at work, but you're going on a much deeper level to kind of really see that and see their strengths. Have you seen a difference then? Like, what's been like? Is there a particular, have you seen like, have people implemented it and it's made a difference to their lives as well going forwards?
We've seen some fantastic results from, and I think this is
Really?
this
Wow.
is dependent on the work that people do themselves. When people, we provide a level of psychoeducation, and we provide, all of the things that will build and support. We provide the framework, but it's the people who are coming in
Mm,
and really want to change, really want to work harder, really want to take that time to introspect. Fantastic results. People deciding to change careers. You've had people who've decided to restudy. I've known of people who've decided to change
mm,
and go in completely different directions. Also spoken to people who've said, I'm going to need to go into this therapeutically. I'm going to, speak to a psychotherapist. And I realize that this is
amazing.
blocking me in developing this. So I'm going to need to go deeper. So people being able to
Mm,
pause and see themselves through a range
mm,
of different interventions has been really helpful in people being able to decide what their next step is. So it's been really,
mm.
really beneficial. And hopefully our paper is going to be pulling together some sort of evidence base that will really help qualify things.
Oh, it's amazing. I love that. I can't wait to read it, to be fair. Like, it's just it sounds really interesting. Because you mentioned about this research that you're doing currently. Is it kind of like looking at the workplace, isn't it? Really?
It's there's an
And can you tell us more about what? Yeah.
sorry, I spoke over you. Say that again.
Oh, that's okay. No worries, no worries. It was, yeah, just kind of asking about your research and what your hope for it is, and what you kind of try, what subjects and topics you're currently trying to cover currently.
Yeah, so one piece of research is looking at an evaluative outcome of the program. So it's
Mm,
what had people achieved at the end. So using a bit of qualitative and a bit of quantitative to be able to
mm,
understand and articulate. So we took a sort of a subsection of people who came onto the pilot program, and we're looking at that as a sort of a formal evaluation, but also putting that out as a potential intervention that's traditionally speaking, working with people who've come from traumatic situations and traumatic scenarios. A therapeutic approach is commonly used. Therapy absolutely has its place. What we're looking at is, could we look at potentially a hybrid, a combination of something which is
mm.
solution focused but also therapeutic in nature. So that's kind of the nature of that paper. And the second piece of research really
Wonderful.
is a 3-year follow-on. So we're now in 2023, and it's doing a bit of a deep dive with one
Mm,
individual around 3 years later. What's life like? What has life like been like for you? What things did you take on board? Where are you in life now? And how did the program assist you with that? So it provides not just part of that sort of building evidence base to support that body of work, but also for us real insight into, how did this work? How was this for somebody when they weren't in front of us, when they weren't in the room? What kind of
mm.
things preceded before they joined on the program? So we get a much deeper and fuller insight into how the program worked with and affected people.
Oh, I love that. I love that, and it's so important that it's evidence based as well, right? Like it's we often like just and for me like carry out these programs and hope for the best. Like it's going to make a positive impact on people, and to be fair, get evaluated. The programs get evaluated, but it's like you want to see over a long term period the long term effect, right? That these interventions are having, I think as well, because then you're doing the work and like it's working as well, which I think is wonderful. So I mean, in terms of the program, like how does it work? Is it run like at the workplace? Is it run privately? Is it like for groups of people? Is it one to one? How does that structure work?
So it's a group. I should say what it will look like as and when we
Okay,
set it
perfect.
back up. Is there is the potential for either. So with organisations would be a potential vehicle that we're looking at, but also with people individually, it's a group-based intervention. So there's a psychoeducation component. There is also a group-based learning component, but there's also individual one-to-one sessions, which is really where you can start drilling down into, okay,
Mm,
me personally, this is where I want to go. The psychoeducation gives you the broad view of I don't know, topics like, post-traumatic stress disorder, understanding what happens to the brain
Right.
as and when we're in a place of
Right.
stress. And so there is that psychoeducation, which is important. But then there is also the individual one-to-ones, which brings it down to the level of the individual. What is it that they want to work on during that period? What things, how is and how has their situation, how has the abuse that they've experienced impacted them in their lives? So we can get a chance to be very detailed, very, very individual, but also working with them at a group level, because so much happens in group dynamics, group interaction, group learning. At points, you really just need to step back and facilitate and watch and help and guide the discussions. So yeah, it's sort of a combination of all three: psychoeducation, looking at group-based learning, but also individual, what we're calling kind of therapeutic coaching sessions as well. So they all work.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that. Yeah, absolutely. It's important to have that holistic approach, isn't it, really, to kind of hit it from all sides so you're able to do the work. Because I really do enjoy like the sort of the larger cohorts of being able to deliver to a number of people, but then actually the work is really done in the one-to-ones as well, isn't it? Like really, getting to the core, the crux of what's going on, because everyone's individual, everyone has different experiences. So I think that, I love how you're kind of like, enabling all three areas and being able to help people in that sense as well. So you say, so basically the program is yet to be set up. Like, when are you hoping to go live with the program?
Probably towards the end of this year, beginning of next year, because what we want to focus on was kind of getting all of the evidence, getting the paper, and then looking to see where we can get the paper published, and then sort of turning our attention into how we want to best use psychoeducation, potentially using an online learning platform for those elements, but also thinking about our marketing as well, who we're going to be approaching, how we're going to be packaging it up. I think what we wanted to do was really make sure that we had a good evidence-based program, so that if we were ever sort of challenged necessarily around, is this effective? Can you see demonstrable results? Have we learned from the pilot to really take the time to learn the lessons and implement that into sort of our first program by the time we've launched, having the evidence base, having the experience, and also taking on board the lessons for launching fully.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's you're targeting, it's I haven't heard of any programs actually targeting this area of domestic abuse and filling the gaps. So I think what you're doing is incredible and much needed as well, because it does affect all areas of our life. How do people, how do people get in touch with you? Like, if they want some help and they want to be able to, like, because like, how they kind of approach you, or do people just come to you because they know what you're doing and ask for help?
Generally speaking,
Yeah.
that's how it's. A lot. I get a lot of people contacting me on LinkedIn, or there are sort of onward referrals. But I think as part of all of the marketing and strategy to release the program, I think we'll need to be thinking a bit more around how we get people to sign up, that whole sort of customer journey. But for the moment, I get a lot of contact through LinkedIn, and
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
recommendations.
Yeah, indeed. And what's the aspirations for encouraging her over the next sort of few years? What is it? What's your? Because you like goals. I know you like
I
goals.
do love a goal. I
So-
do love a goal. I think paper published and a formalized course, the formalized program launched. They're the kind of the two big things, and probably in that order. Not wanting to kind of thwart the thoughts that are coming along with the lessons learned that are coming out, but sort of putting the paper to bed feels like a sort of a good
Mm,
first step. And then secondly, building in some of those learnings from that program, and seeing how those can sort of slot
mm.
into a really nicely presented program. And say, I think it was a great pilot, but I think we've learned a lot of lessons from the pilot to really make it different. It's already different, it's already unique, but to really sort of market it right.
Absolutely, and you want to be sure, right, as well. So it sounds like you're doing all the right steps to kind of get there and create. I'm sure it's going to be an incredible moving program that will help so many people to get through, because like you said, it's a complex area, and like just to be able to get that help and support is amazing, especially in the workplace as well, right? Where, I mean, there are maybe initiatives, but I don't think they go deep enough into helping people enough. I don't think, from a range of issues that they may be suffering from, as well. So I think this is going to be amazing. And so, how can people get in touch with you if they want to hear more about the program?
People can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I can assure you I'll be the only Priscilla Akutu-Carter on there. So a simple type in and they'll find me. I can promise. And I always welcome sort of virtual coffees and getting to know, and discussing either parts of my research or work further.
Amazing, amazing. And I have one last question for you, which I ask everyone as well, and that is, how do you find the power within you to kind of manage your own sort of mental health now for the future, or or how could other people help themselves as well if they're going through the domestic abuse? Do you think?
Yeah, really good. So personally, I use mindfulness and meditation daily. Personally. That really helps to ground, to center me. And if I haven't done it, I can feel it. And by that, I mean, there'll be the smallest signs. Sorry about that. There'll be there'll be the smallest signs that either I'll react in a way that I wouldn't usually, or I'll get distracted in a way that I wouldn't usually, that I can usually tell if I've fallen off the wagon, so to speak, for a couple of days, I can usually tell. It helps to keep you grounded.
Yeah, it's true though. Especially if it's ingrained to your routine. I think that's amazing. Lots of people try mindfulness and meditation, but they just cannot seem to sustain it. Like, is there like something that you can share of? Is it just persistence basically of doing it every day?
There's an element of persistence, but I think there's teamwork. So I learned mindfulness with somebody. So there was myself and somebody else who we had the opportunity to share, and it's great to have somebody to share insights with and experience of practice. That's always useful. And making use of some great apps. There is, the Calm and the Headspace, there's the Calm, there's Insight Timer, which is a fantastic app, which has got meditators from all over the world putting in sort of various different meditations. And I would say it's so varied and there's so many different creators. Try different. Just because one technique may not work, try another. There's too much science and evidence to show what happens to the brain when we do meditation. There's so much evidence out there.
Absolutely. When you stop thinking and you're in the present, and I feel the same. Like things come to you, ideas come to you, inspiration strikes. As well sometimes, and sometimes they don't. But like I've had there's been times where I've just had like these ideas that have come, because I've just stopped and just, and that could be through, like this, traditional sort of meditation of like deep breathing, or through, I learned to swim a couple of years ago, through swimming maybe as well, where I'm just in breath and like just, things come to you whilst you're swimming. It's just amazing ways that you can do it, right, as well. Are there any sort of particular practices that you use that help?
I practice transcendental meditation. So I learned that it was before the pandemic, and then I used it consistently for about a year or so, and I brought it back when the pandemic started, and have continued consistently there. So transcendental meditation is about sort of focusing in on a mantra, and I do that between once and twice a day, and that makes quite a big difference. But even just going out for a walk,
amazing.
Just a little walk somewhere that's not too far away. And there's times where, go out with my music, and sometimes if it's in a space like a park, take my music out, just see what I can hear, see what I can see.
Listen to the birds.
Just listen to the birds. Simple.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I really, really encourage everyone to, give it another go. If you tried it and you feel like it hasn't worked, give it another go, because it is a wonderful thing to do, and it does really help calm your mind and set you up nicely for the day, I think, as well. But I think it's just getting into it and practicing it probably, which is what people find difficult to do, Yeah. Does that help, do you think, also for people yeah, exactly. Do you think that also helps for when it comes to domestic abuse, it's quite significant, and it's detrimental to their own well-being? Are there any sort of like self-help practices that people can do, including the mindfulness?
I think mindfulness is and there's always sort of the line of not wanting to re-trigger themselves necessarily, but when we were talking at the top of the discussion around introspection, I think stopping and understanding how you feel is hugely important, especially if decision making has been questioned in the past. People have had to call into account their own ability to make decisions. I think one of the most beneficial exercises has been teaching people to have confidence in the decisions that they make. Because when people's sense of self, there's a level of impairment there, people then don't trust themselves. So being however simple the decision is, making that decision and standing by that decision, and almost giving yourself a bit of a panel. Yeah, I made that decision. This is what we're doing today, and I'm going ahead with it. Getting that real feeling of being self-directed, and when it comes to introspection, giving yourself space to understand how you feel is really quite important. Going back to that discussion of emotions being our guide, that emotional state being our guide. And oftentimes, if something's wrong, we can feel it. If we stop and give ourselves enough space, we can feel it. There's something, that niggling voice in your mind that says, is this right? Is that, if you're asking the question, continue asking the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so true, isn't it? And yeah, I think that's just incredible advice, just being able to make that time and space for reflection, being able to like really tune into how you're feeling, because that will guide you going forwards as well, I think. Wonderful conversation, Priscilla. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom, sharing your incredible program. That's going to be amazing and inspiring and change people's lives. I think it's wonderful what you're doing, and I wish you all the best going forwards as well. But yeah, thank you so much for being on the Power Within You podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.